We're going to talk today on topic 9, the CSD 411 somatosensory. First part, this will be part 1, which will include the first 21 slides. This is the outline of the entire somatosensory lecture. Will be an introduction, talk about sensory transduction, different types of somatosensory receptors, responses of these receptors, sensory nerve endings, which is the simplest form of nerve endings. They're like dendrites. We'll talk about the primary afferent axons that are going to synapse either within the spinal cord or synapse into the brainstem. We talked about dermatomes already, so we won't talk about that. We'll talk a little bit about sensory organization of the spinal cord. We'll talk a little bit more of the medial lemniscal system. We'll talk about the trigeminal touch pathway, somatic sensory areas of the cortex, pain, spinal cerebellar system, and temperature. This is new, and so I thought this would be helpful. The learning outcomes that I want you to get from this lecture is list the types of somatic and visceral sensory receptors and describe how they function and sensation, describe the roles of receptor potentials and adaptation, that is a decrease in response to continued stimulation. Know what sensory receptors are tonic receptors, and which are slowly adapting receptors. Phasic receptors, which are rapidly adapting receptors. Differentiate between primary and secondary receptors. Know the major ascending sensory tracts and indicate a function for each. Describe the sensory and associate areas of the cerebral cortex in which sensory information is going to eventually project into. So when we talk about sensation, what we're talking about is senses. This is a means by which the brain receives information about itself, the body, as well as the environment. There are two different types, general and special senses. General senses are distributed over large parts of the body. They're broken down either into somatic or visceral. Somatic senses are touch, pressure, temperature, proprioception, and pain. Visceral involves internal organs and mostly consists of pain and pressure. Your special senses are smell, taste, sight, hearing, balance. So sensation or perception is the conscious awareness of the stimuli being received by that sensory receptor. A good example is a painful stimulation. There are different types of sensory receptors. Most of these sensory receptors are somatic, and they are referred to as mechanical receptors. That is, they're sensitive to physical distortions such as binding, bending, or stretching. At the heart of each mechanoreceptor receptor are unmyelinated axon branches. These contain these mechanical sensitive ion channels, and so this physical distortion causes an activation of these mechanical sensitive ion channels, which ultimately leads to the generation of an action potential. There are different types of mechanoreceptors. There are chemoreceptors, which responds to smell and taste, thermal receptors, temperature, photoreceptors to light, nociceptors to pain, and so forth. General principle of sensory transduction is pretty much what we talked about in terms of propagation of an action potential. First, you're going to get the activation of these mechanoreceptors, and it's a graded response. And so, in order to elicit an action potential, you have to reach threshold, and so you're going to need these receptors are going to have to detect an adequate stimulus in order to elicit a change in the membrane potential enough to elicit either a depolarization, hyperpolarization that's going to elicit the generation of an active potential. Receptor potentials are just these graded potentials that can either spatially or temporally summate on each other until they reach threshold, then elicit an action potential. Then the action potential then is propagated either in the receptor itself, the mechanoreceptor, receptor, or in the neuron, that is, the neuron contained within the dorsal root ganglia that's connected to that receptor. The sensory transduction in terms of frequency coded stimulus is the number of action potential that are being generated per unit time. In addition, something referred to as a population code, all that is that more receptors are being activated as you increase, for example, a touch stimulation or a pain stimulation. These sensory or pain responses are coded, that is, that nerve fibers in the skin that carry pressure information are physically different than information in the skin that carries information about pain. And they travel differently too. And so this is something that you'll see a little bit later. Adaptation is really just a decrease in response to persistent stimulation. And so you'll learn that these different type of mechanoreceptors, Meissner and Purkinje, corpuscles respond differently, that respond quickly, but then stop firing even though the stimuli persist. So they're rapidly adapting. Merkel-Dis and Rufian endings, they're slowly adapting, and they generate a more sustained response, so long-lasting stimulation. The adaptation can either occur at the receptor site, or it could occur in the brain itself. The receptive field is the area that the body surface that causes a sensory nerve cell to respond. So here we're just looking at the different types of mechanoreceptors, the Purkinje, Meissner, Merkel, and Ruffinian. It just describes the different receptive fields, and so Purkinje has a large receptive field. It's very vague in terms of its borders. It is a fast-adapting mechanoreceptor as compared to Meissner. In terms of the receptive field, has a very small, sharp border, so you could be able to identify that stimulation a lot easier as compared to Purkinje. But Meissner also is a fast-adapting mechanoreceptor. Your slower adapting ones are your Merkel and Ruffinian endings. Merkel's disc has sharp borders. You're able to identify that response, but they're slowly adapting. Rufian's endings, they have vague borders, and they're also slow adapting. There are different types of nerve endings. The most simplest is your free nerve ending, which responds to co-receptors in warm and pain. These receptor endings are like dendrites. The more complex nerve endings are Merkel's and hair follicles, Purkinje's, Meissner, Ruffinian, muscle spindle, and Golgi tendon organ. And so here it just shows a list of the sensory information that they respond to and stuff. And so I would like for you to kind of be aware of these types of stimulus. For example, Meissner corpuscle responds to a two-point discrimination. That is the ability to detect stimulation in two distinct receptor fields by touching at 2 points of the skin, is Meissner corpuscle. This diagram just shows where these different types of mechanoreceptors are located. I do not want you to memorize this. This just gives you an idea of where they're located. Responses of sensory receptors, again, they respond to changes to skin, deformed or changed the nerve ending. This is going to activate these ion permeability receptors, generate a depolarizing current and triggers an action potential once threshold is made. Some are rapidly adapting, others are slowly adapting, and this gives you an idea of which is rapidly and slow. The different types of afferent axons for these mechanical receptors are the alpha, A beta, delta, and C. Your delta and C, they mediate pain and temperature. Your A alpha and A beta, they mediate touch sensations. And so you see there's differences in terms of myelination. In the case of your C fibers, they're unmyelinated. The A delta are lightly myelinated, and then as you go from the A beta to the alpha, you see an increase in myelination. Increase in myelination also is going to affect the conduction and action potential. So the more myelinated, they're heavily myelinated, the faster the action potential propagation. In terms of the organization of the spinal cord, is that again, spinal cord is divided into the dorsal horn, intermediate zone, and ventral horn. Dorsal horn, the same thing as anterior. Ventral horn, the same thing as posterior horn. And intermediate zone, the same thing as intermediate gray area. And so we see information coming in from, for example, from an A beta axon. It'll make a collateral synapse here, for example, in terms of a reflex. And then it's going to run into the posterior fasciculus, or what we called earlier, dorsal column. And it's going to run, in this case, because of the fact that it's coming from probably upper extremities, it's going to run into the fasciculus cuneatus, into its synapses. And so this would be your primary motor neuron right here. And where its synapses would be your secondary motor neuron. And so your first order neurons are cell bodies that are contained within the dorsal root ganglia. They're the ones that are going to collect the information from the periphery and transmit to second order neurons. Second order neurons are either in the spinal cord or brainstem, and that depends on the modality of the sensation. They will projections cross midline, and they ascend to the contralateral or the opposite thalamus. Your third order is going to be contained within the thalamus, and then they're going to project to the cerebral cortex. And so here we're looking at the dorsal column system, and what we're going to look at is either a two-point discrimination, proprioception, pressure, or vibration. We see that the information is ascending on the from the fasciculus gracilis. It ascends, is going to synapse into the second order neuron, which is the gracilis nucleus right here. Gives rise to the internal arcuate fibers. They're going to cross over to the contralateral side, and then they're going to ascend as the medial lemniscus, and then they're going to project into the contralateral thalamus, specifically the ventroposterior lateral thalamic nucleus. And so the tracts associated with this information, depending on the segment, will be either the fasciculus gracilis or fasciculus cuneatus. Again, these are information for touch, vibration of the skin, and path to the brain is completely different than that, for example, of pain, temperature. And so again, this just shows a little bit more of what we just talked about in terms of how the dorsal column nuclei, gracilis and cuneatus, the second order, are going to synapse into the thalamus, the ventroposterior lateral thalamic nucleus, and then from there they're relayed into the primary sensory cortex. The spinal cord innervates different patterns. Discriminative touch ascends ipsilateral on the side of input, where your decussation occurs again once they synapse onto the second order neuron. Pain, temperature are different. They will cross immediately, so your primary neuron will synapse within the spinal cord, and then they will cross over and ascend on the contralateral side. And so this, again, just follow this in terms of the spinal autonomic divisions. They're shown here. as compared to pain and temperature. And so this shows just a diagram of what I just talked about in terms of where you find the tracks of your dorsal column medial meniscal system, and where you find your lateral spinal thalamic, anterior spinal thalamic tracks as they're going to ascend into the thalamus. And we're going to stop here for part 1.